Me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here. I apologize for those of you who've seen me before. You gotta see me again, but here we are. And today we're gonna be talking about something that is very seasonal, wildlife in winter. So we'll be kind of covering some of my personal favorite species of wildlife. Yes, that includes bugs, of course. And we'll kind of also talk about a couple of ways that we all can support insects and wildlife, even in the winter when it seems like everybody's all bundled up and not very active. So, as Deb mentioned, I am the engagement manager at Stoneleigh. Who here has never been to Stoneleigh? Deb, that's too many hands. That's too many hands. So in the past, we need another bus trip. In the past, we have organized bus trips with Hershey's Mill to come on out to Stoneleigh. Maybe it's time for another one, who knows? But for those of you who don't know, Stoneleigh is one of the newest public gardens in the Philadelphia area. We opened in 2018. So in the grand scheme of public gardens, Longwood, Bartram's, some of the oldest gardens, in the country, let alone the Philadelphia area, we're just a baby. We're just a baby public garden. But that doesn't mean that we are a baby estate. So the estate itself, which is called Stoneleigh, has been in existence for about 150 years. And 3 families over the course of that time have all lived at Stoneleigh. And in 2016, the most recent tenant of Stoneleigh as an estate, the Haas family, donated the estate, a transition fund, their home, and an endowment fund to support Stoneleigh as a public garden. All of that is incredible, amazing. And so it's a 42-acre public garden. When we got the garden, lots of beautiful old trees, not so much in way of perennial plants or shrubs. So we have had a real ball reimagining some of these historic and existing spaces like this 120-year-old pergola. This now has been reimagined with over 80 different species of native plants. And that's like, yes, exciting. And so we're reimagining these existing spaces, and we are also introducing and building new spaces in the garden, like the pool house. This used to be the family swimming pool. Swimming pools built in the 80s, not very much in this, vibe of a public garden. So instead we turned it into a really beautiful terrace. And now we get to experiment with some of these really cool perennials and shrubs and even trees that we're pruning into fun hedges. So, but we're not talking about then, we're talking about now, and it is winter. Luckily, we got some snow, so we got to see something a little bit like this not too long ago. Very nice after last year's dud of a winter. The garden in the snow is gorgeous, and I'm sure that here at Hershey's Mill, all of your gardens that you work really hard to build are also gorgeous in the snow. But it's not just about being beautiful, it's also about being biodiverse. And so in the winter, despite the fact that things kind of slow down and get a little calmer, our garden spaces, our green spaces are still doing a lot of work supporting a lot of the wildlife that we share these spaces with. And when we talk about what do wildlife do during the winter, there's many different factors that we have to kind of bring into play. And, there's lots and lots of different strategies for wildlife weathering the winter. And so the first thing that we have to think about is that species of wildlife ectothermic or endothermic? I'm going to take you back to intro to bio. Okay, so endothermic means that they produce their own heat. That's mammals, that's birds. Ectothermic means that they rely on the existing or outside temperature to regulate their body temperature. So that's frogs, turtles, reptiles, and insects. So you can imagine something that creates its own heat, maybe a little bit better at weathering the winter in certain ways than something that relies on the temperature outside to regulate its body temperature. Okay, so now what else is a factor? Size. Size is a really, really big factor in how a species weathers the winter. Is the animal very small? Is it very large? And this comes into play specifically with those endothermic animals that produce their own heat, because see that cute little mouse over there on the right? Very small. Doesn't have a lot of volume for its surface area. So it loses a lot of heat per unit of volume, per unit of its body. Compare that to a fox, much larger animal. Well, larger animal, not much larger. It's not a bear, but larger animal. So it has a lower volume to surface area ratio. So it can maintain, it doesn't lose as much heat per body unit as, say, a mouse. And then you've got things that kind of fall in the middle, like that adorable chipmunk. Who thinks chipmunks are adorable? Okay, phew. There's chipmunk haters out there, and I understand where you're coming from, but look at that face. And then lastly, the third kind of major factor regarding how a species weathers the winter is about food availability and resource availability. What does that animal need to eat or use in order to survive, right? Can it eat seeds? Can it eat berries? Does it eat insects? Is it a carnivore? Does it need a lot of water? All of these factors combine to determine how a species weathers the winter. And so, what do they do? Well, the most obvious option for weathering the winter is actually to avoid it altogether, right? And that's called migration. And so a lot of our birds are migratory. Specifically, they are neotropical migrants. So here's an example, a wood thrush. Really beautiful thrush. Has anyone heard the sound of a wood thrush? Oh, it's magic. If you haven't heard it, go home and play it and sing yourself to sleep because it's amazing. But these wood thrush, they breed up here. They spend the summer up here, but then it gets too cold. They need to go to a place where there's more resources for them. So they make a multi-thousand-mile journey down to South Central America and North South America. Oh my gosh, so many directions. And you can see here this really, really cool graphic that shows breeding and wintering. Breeding and overwintering grounds. And so they do that every single year that they are alive, which is amazing. And a lot of our bird species do this, specifically our warblers and things like that. Even tiny birds, like the ruby-throated hummingbird, this does it too. Is that crazy? It's wild. So ruby-throated hummingbirds, very, very small bird. They make, again, multi-thousand-mile journeys. This is where we can make some really strong decisions in our planting, because you can imagine making that journey very energetically expensive. So what can we plant in order to support that? Trumpet honeysuckle, some of their really favorite foods. So when we think about hummingbirds, it's going to be those orange and red trumpet-shaped flowers. Trumpet honeysuckle is a native vine, super easy to grow, super easy to train, and it'll bloom. We have some blooming in the garden now. Not saying that there's any hummingbirds in the garden now, but they will bloom into December and even January. So incredible. So these guys are avoiding winter altogether. But birds aren't the only species that migrate these really long distances. Monarchs, they are the poster child of insect migration, right? We all know about monarchs. They are specialists as caterpillars. They only feed on milkweed. And here's just a quick overview of what their life cycle looks like over the year. So they have spent their winter in the boreal forests of Mexico. Spring comes, it's March, it's late February, they start moving up. And in the spring, they stop in southeastern US, they find milkweed, they lay their eggs, the caterpillars hatch, caterpillars eat a bunch of milkweed, they turn into adults, and then they move a little bit further north. And then that happens again, and then they move a little bit further north. And so that's what, 1, 2, 3 generations. In that last generation, they lay their eggs, that caterpillar hatches, the adult emerges, and stop. They do not mate. They go into something called reproductive diapause, and everything in them says, fly south. And so that fourth generation flies 2,000 to 3,000 miles, depending on where they are, back to the boreal forests of Mexico. Those 3 other generations, they live between 2 and 5 weeks. That last generation, 8 months. 8 months. And so they spend that time in the boreal forests of Mexico where it's really humid, the temperature is fairly stable. It does get a little frosty, but not too cold. And they gather on these branches to keep them from desiccating. And then again, February comes, that switch turns back on, they mate and they start moving north. And so when we talk about supporting monarchs, it's not just about planting milkweed, because milkweed's not blooming when they're making this multi-thousand-mile trip down south. That's when we have to plant those fall blooming native perennials that have that powerhouse nectar. Asters, goldenrods, sunflowers. Asters, goldenrods, sunflowers. Those are some powerhouse perennials. They support insects in all sorts of ways, but especially monarchs on their long journey. So monarchs get all that buzz about their migration, but they're not the only insect that migrates. In fact, we're learning all the time that more and more insects migrate. The common green darner, has anyone seen one of these dragonflies? Can anyone show me how big they are? Say that? More like that. Huge. One of our largest dragonfly species. Look at the colors on it too. Is that amazing? These guys are so cool. And we found out through some really cool science that this species of dragonfly migrates. They don't migrate quite as far as the monarchs. They actually migrate down to kind of southeastern US, a little bit into Mexico. But you'll see here they have 3 generations. I know that this is kind of like a crazy graphic right now, but they've got 3 generations. So right about now, we've got generation number 1. They're in the southeast. They're going to start emerging in the next couple of months. That generation will migrate north, where there's so many resources, so much food. They'll lay eggs. That generation will emerge. They'll feed. And then they'll move back down south. And then we've got this 3rd generation that stays in the south, which is really cool. And so the way that they found this was a combination of community scientists, formerly known as citizen science. People were observing these large masses of green darners, hunting over meadows and then moving. And then secondly, they used museum specimens to figure out, based on isotopes in their wings, where they emerged versus where they were collected. So cool. Can I explain any more than that? I cannot. It's a little bit beyond my pay grade, but feel free to reference Hallworth MP 2018 Tracking Progress of Green Darners. And so again, I mentioned specifically for monarchs, we can plant some of these really beautiful plants like asters. For hummingbirds, we can plant this trumpet honeysuckle, which is this red. And then those green darners, they're not plant feeders. They are predators. So how can we support them as they're migrating south? We can have meadows. We can provide them with hunting grounds. So at Stoneleigh, we had a mass of green darners come down. I don't know, it was like 3 years ago. It was spectacular. I took so many videos, and you look at it and it's just blurs. It means nothing unless you were there. But they were hunting over our meadow, and you can see masses of 50 to 300 darners all hunting in the same area, which is really, really cool. So we can provide them with meadows as hunting ground and not mow those meadows down in the fall. Let them stand over winter. And then again, just a couple of examples of those asters that we can plant. There's an aster for every situation. Sun, shade, blue wood asters are a great one for shade. Look at all those colors. And then goldenrods as well. Goldenrods tend to get a bad rap. Who thinks goldenrods are horrible and aggressive? All right, we got a knowledgeable group of people here, or just a scared group of people who knew that that wasn't the right answer. Yes, there are some goldenrods that are very aggressive, but we are in the capital of goldenrods here in America. We have over 120 species of goldenrods in North America. So I can guarantee you there's a right goldenrod for your garden. And here's a couple of examples of ones that are well behaved and really beautiful. And zigzag goldenrod is shade tolerant. Woo. And then lastly, I mentioned those sunflowers. Woodland sunflower, aptly named, shade tolerant. I know a lot of people think of these perennials as sun loving, but there are some shade tolerant options. Plus, look how gorgeous. So sunny. We also have birds that migrate, but they actually migrate to us. We are their vacation because they spend most of the rest of the year up in Canada. Now, these are called North American migrants, and we view these as our winter birds, right? The white-throated sparrow, the dark-eyed juncos. These are the birds we only see in winter, and that's because they are breeding up in Canada and northern US. So they come to us. They think it's nice and balmy here compared to their homeland. And we get to spend the winter with these really beautiful birds, specifically the white-throated sparrow, who has that lovely song that always is evocative of winter. And so these guys are mostly feeding on seeds. So you'll see them foraging in meadows, on the ground, in leaf litter, in woodlands. They're looking for anything that they can get their beaks on. That's mostly seeds, but they can sometimes find worms, small arthropods, spiders, things like that too. So how can we support these birds that spend the winter with us? In addition to providing hunting grounds like meadows, not removing our leaves so that they can forage on those insects, we can also plant plants that berry in the wintertime. We're leading into winter. So eastern red cedar, these have just been totally cleaned at the garden. The cardinals finally came in, took all the berries off that eastern red cedar. We still have a couple of American holly berries hanging on in the garden. Holly berries in particular, they like them to go through a few frosts before they're nice and tasty. They get a little fermented. I think we can all appreciate a little fermentation. Fermentation science, as my father-in-law would say. So adding some of these plants into our garden spaces is just one way that we support these North American migrants and the birds that stick around with us through the winter. We can also support them by providing them with places to hide. We were just talking about hawks earlier. This is a hawk's favorite time of year because they don't have to look through all those leaves to find their prey, right? It's a lot easier for them to hunt. There's not as much for them to hunt. It's a lot easier because they can see really far. So since there are no leaves on the trees, or at least some of the trees, let's provide them with other places for those birds to hide. Now, is this the most beautiful brush pile? No, you can make it more attractive than this, but leaving branches that fall during winter storms, piling them up, really provides some nice spaces for these birds to spend the winter. All right, look at this cutie pie. Do you guys have foxes here? I imagine you do. Oh, overwhelming yes. So foxes are actually often more visible in the winter than they are in the summer months, even though they spend the entire year with us, because they have to be a little bit more adventurous when it comes to finding their prey. And so the way that foxes overwinter is actually they blow out their coats and they put on a winter coat that's much warmer, and they use all of their senses. And especially in the winters when they kind of really lean into that omnivore. So most of the rest of the year, they're hunting lots of things, little mice, and they continue to do that in the winter because they have super sharp hearing. They can hear a mice under snow from over 100 yards away, but they also feed on berries. They'll find some trash if they can, some carrion. They really lean into the omnivore because they have fewer options. You'll also see them out and about because they actually sun themselves in the winter. So at Stoneleigh, we have a big pile of leaves that we turn over. It generates a lot of heat because it's almost like a compost pile. Often a fox is curled up on the top of that pile. So they'll find the warmest places and just sun themselves to kind of get that radiant heat. So another animal that we actually hear and see a little bit more in the winter is the great horned owl. I was going to do a mimic of their call, and then I got a little shy, so I'm not going to do it. I know. Hold on. Maybe later. You might catch me a little bit later at the right time. But great horned owls, there you go. See? I knew I could count on him. So their nesting season actually begins in February. So in late January and February, you'll start hearing them hooting. They're very territorial. So you'll hear one hoot and then the other echoes it, and they're essentially establishing their territories. And then egg laying starts in late February, and it'll continue, and they'll raise that young all the way into late spring and early summer before they fledge. And great horned owls, they're a huge bird. They're enormous. And so they rely on some very specific dead trees because they use hollows in dead trees as their nesting sites. So this is a really important reason for us not to take down every single dead tree. And if you were here, when did I do that one? Last February, I did a whole talk about the wildlife associated with dead trees. So I apologize again if I am reiterating information, but it's really important because people complain about wildlife coming into their attics, their chimneys, things like that. And we'll talk about a few more that are a little bit more quote unquote pesky than an owl. But it's because we've eliminated their natural habitat because we cut down every single tree. So let's not cut down every single tree. We can advocate for standing trees, especially in woods, right? It's the circle of life. We can also, in more quote unquote formal areas, we can promote maybe cutting a tree at 12 or 15 feet. Even something like that will support wildlife. Now, great horned owls, they like to nest at like 20 to 40 feet tall. So we really need big trees for them. But some of these other wildlife that we'll talk about can use those smaller snags. And these guys, again, as you know with owls, really, really adept at hunting. So they don't really have an issue finding those little mice, rabbits, and other things that come out at night. Now here's one of those quote unquote pesky guys. Who has had southern flying squirrels in their attic before? Oh, only one person, but not here, not here. So flying squirrels often get into people's attics, and why wouldn't they? It's nice and warm in there. But again, they are spending their winter in snags. Sometimes they're actually using abandoned nest boxes, but anything that is like a cavity. And southern flying squirrels, they don't technically hibernate, but they go into a state of reduced metabolism. And they will actually do so in family groups. So they'll all, in a family group, find a cavity or an abandoned nest box. They'll go in there, they'll lower their body temperature, they'll lower their metabolic rate, and they rely on not just the cavity to provide warmth, but the radiant heat of the other southern flying squirrels too. But that means that they can take advantage of like a really warm day or a really warm night. They can come out, they can do some foraging, then they'll come back in because they're not in true hibernation. And there's been studies that show not only is the nesting with other southern flying squirrels good for that radiant heat, but because they do it in family groups, it actually strengthens those familial bonds, which is adorable. And look at that face. Again, I think almost everything's cute or adorable or sweet. So, and again, supporting both of these, we can really do so by keeping dead wood in the garden, dead trees. So this tree on the left is an old yew, and the tree on the right is a dead pine that we cut off at about 12 feet. So as that starts to decay, cavities will start to form, or woodpeckers will come in and create cavities, and lots of different wildlife can use that. And we actually made a what we call tree sculpture out of a dead tree right in front of the house too. really promoting our message front and center, that we can support wildlife and create beautiful gardens. We're in the process of climbing wisteria up this, right? Imagine that in the spring. So, speaking of things that hibernate for the winter, bats, right? I know. Does this photo freak anyone out? A little bit, yeah? Bats have a bad reputation. I will say, I acknowledge it, but they're very, very cute. You got it, you guessed it. So we have 9 species of bats in Pennsylvania. Three of those species spend the winter here. The other 6 are actually migratory, so they'll move out of this area and they'll move further south. But we can support all of these species in many ways with our winter spaces. So these are the 3 bats that stick around and they hibernate here. They use caves, they'll use barns, any large spaces because they hibernate in large groups. And has anyone heard of white nose syndrome or white nose fungus? Yeah, so that is something that has wiped out about 99% of our hibernating bats. It's really unfortunate. And one of the reasons that it's so deadly is because, first of all, we know, we just went through COVID. When everyone's all together, disease spreads more quickly. And so over the winter, when they're all together, that disease or that fungus spreads really quickly. It also wakes them up out of their hibernation, which depletes all of the resources that they have. And so coming out of winter is much more difficult because sometimes they'll die in the middle of winter because they've utilized all their resources. Hibernation is supposed to be for a long, extended period of time. But if they keep waking up, they raise their body heat, they lower it, they raise it, they lower it. So it utilizes all that energy. And so bats, really, really important for our ecosystems. And it's very difficult to support bats of these species unless you have a cave here at Hershey's Mill. Not that anyone knows of. So these are really more supported in some of the areas where there are natural caves. However, we can support those bats that migrate during the winter. This is a silver-haired bat over here on the left. We found it at Stoneleigh. It's cute. It's very cute. And so the ways that we can support these bats is actually providing really protected spaces for them to spend the day. So they fly and migrate at night. They have to spend the day somewhere really safe. So that can either be apparently in the corner of a building, or more likely they're using trees that have a lot of texture to spend the daytime because they're so tiny. They can really, cram themselves into a lot of these spaces. So this here is a hackberry. That is the bark of a hackberry tree. It is crazy cool. But all of those little crevices, perfect for a little bat to spend the winter or spend the day while it's migrating down south. Another one is shagbark hickory, and some of our oaks also have that really textured bark that provides them with little spaces that they can spend. Now on to my favorite group of insects, or favorite group is the insects. Now I want everyone to keep an eye out for this one in the coming months. This is a mourning cloak. Has anyone seen a mourning cloak before? Yeah, okay, we've got a couple nods. They are a beautiful butterfly, unlike anything you've ever seen. This one over here on the right is a little bit ragged, but they're gorgeous. And you can see it's a really good dead leaf mimic when it folds up its wings. And that's because they are active in early to late March, sometimes into early April. But they're active before the leaves have emerged on the trees. They actually overwinter as adults. They're one of very few species of insects that overwinter as adults. And so you might be thinking, well, there's no flowers in February, so what are they feeding on? These guys are actually feeding on sap often. So trees, especially in the early spring, will start that sap will start flowing, and any winter damage that happened where branches broke off, that sap will start leaking out of those wounds. They'll take advantage of that. They'll also take advantage of dung. you know, beggars can't be choosers. And carrion. Anyone know what carrion is? Yes, okay. Dead animals, for those who didn't want to ask. So they're taking advantage of anything that really has liquid, and sometimes they'll also puddle. So they'll kind of go to areas with like where there's lots of mud or salts, things like that. And that's how they survive the winter. And then they find a nice little place, just like the bats, under a tree, bark, or in a crevice to spend the winter. But they're active really, really, really early. Another group of a whole other way that insects overwinter is in their pupal phase. So the pupal phase is the stage between the larva and the adult. And we see this especially with our silk moth group. So believe it or not, these are not leaves. These are cocoons of some of our really beautiful moths. And this is where it's really important for us also in the fall, not to remove all of our leaves. So the Polyphemus moth, they actually wrap it around the stem. They leave their cocoon attached to the branch. Same with the Promethea moth. But see how the Luna moth casing is still a green leaf? That's because they make it when the leaf is green. They don't attach it to the branch. So that whole pupal case falls to the ground. Exclude humans in a forested setting. Whew, that is awesome camouflage. Add humans into the mix, and suddenly that is a really bad way to spend the winter, because we have an obsession with clean, leafless gardens, and that does not work for those poor Luna moths. And if we approach our gardens differently, we'll be rewarded with these awesome, awesome moths. So again, we've got the Polyphemus, the Cecropia, Polyphemus, Promethea, and Luna moth. And then we've got other insects that spend the winter as eggs. Now think of it, you know, humans freeze their eggs, insects freeze their eggs. It's kind of just a natural state of stasis, right? And so wheel bugs, for example, they have one of the coolest egg masses. They're almost always laid in these hexagonal forms. Is that crazy? So I got a lot of questions about these. First of all, has anyone seen a wheel bug? Yes. If not, keep an eye out. They're so cool. They're a little bit big. Don't pick them up. They will bite. But does anyone know what it's eating? It is a beetle. It's one of our least favorite beetles. Japanese beetle. Woo! So these guys are generalist predators, so they will eat anything that they can get their rostrums on. That's their straw-like mouth part. But that includes Japanese beetles. But I got a lot of questions about this, you know, when spotted lanternflies first came to this area, because people were checking all of their trees for spotted lanternfly eggs. And they would find this and say, oh my God, I have an alien in my garden. To which I was very happy to say, I mean, maybe alien-like, but you've instead got wheel bugs, which is really, really cool. So again, really easily identified by that hexagonal shape. They've got like a light brown top and really dark brown bottoms to the eggs. Katydids also spend the winter as eggs. We love katydids, right? They provide the sounds of summer. They're gorgeous. They're very funny looking. Some of them are good leaf mimics, so they blend in really well. But their eggs are laid in two lines along thin stems, and they're kind of flat, oval, grayish eggs. And that really freaks people out when they find it in the winter. They think that they've got scale or some other pest, but instead they've got katydids, which is fantastic. And if you're ever pruning and you see something, and you see something like this, and you wonder, oh, I really want to prune this branch, but I don't want to get rid of the katydids, you can check and you can tell if they've hatched, because each of them will have a perfect little round hole at the top where the little katydids have emerged. So if you see the holes, you're good to go. They've hatched, feel free to prune it. Even if they haven't hatched and you still need to prune, cut it and place it in the same kind of orientation somewhere else in your garden. Or leave it and watch them hatch. That'd be really cool too. Another insect that we can actually really see in the winter is the goldenrod gallfly. Now we're not seeing the actual fly, but we are seeing the gall that they create. So goldenrod gallfly is a type of fly, and when goldenrod is growing, it will lay its eggs in the growing stem, and that plant they kind of think of it as like a disease. And so they try and block it off, just like we would do in our own bodies. But that's exactly what the little goldenrod gallflies wanted, because now it's got its own little house. And so those eggs hatch, and the little larvae just eat the inside of the goldenrod gall. They turn into pupa. They wait the winter out like this, and then come spring, they'll hatch out of this gall, fall to the ground, and emerge as flies. What's really cool about these is that inside, obviously, there's a lot of yummy, delicious, protein-filled insect. And so we'll see hairy woodpeckers and downy woodpeckers peck through this and get a nice little scrumptious snack in the winter time. So if you see a big hole in there, a woodpecker had fun. And of course, woolly bears. Everyone always has questions about woolly bears, right? Everyone's seen woolly bears? But have you seen the adult? Has anyone actually thought about what a woolly bear turns into? No. Well, they turn into Isabella tiger moths, which are actually really, really beautiful moths. They're this kind of mustardy yellow color, but we more often than not are seeing the caterpillar, and we often see them in the fall because they're crawling across driveways, across sidewalks, and they're trying to find a nice place to spend the winter, because they spend the winter under a layer of leaves. And they essentially pump glycol, which is the equivalent of antifreeze, into their body in order to survive the winter, right? And then come spring, they come out again, they eat just a little bit more, and then they pupate and turn into this beautiful moth. And we see this with a couple of groups of insects where we see the larvae spend the winter under leaves. Isabella tiger moth or woolly bear is one. There's also the giant leopard moth, which is very similar to a woolly bear, but it's bigger and all black, if anyone has seen that. And lots of species of fireflies actually spend the winter as larvae underneath the leaves. And so when people ask, where are all the fireflies? You can say, well, do you put all your leaves in a bag and put it at the curb? That's where your fireflies are. So fireflies really, and again, woolly bears, rely on keeping our leaves as much as possible to provide that blanket that they can spend the winter under. And it doesn't need to look ugly. You know, we do it in the garden all the time. This is not a huge layer of leaves, but it's enough to provide insects with what they need. And it's not just leaving leaves either. There's a lot of other insects that use plant parts to spend the winter. Acorns, if anyone has heard of acorn weevils, they utilize acorns over the winter. And this over here, anyone know what that is? It's a native mantis egg case. Yeah. So we have 3 species of non-native mantises, but 1 species of native mantis, the Carolina mantis. And this one was very clever and used the backside of a piece of sycamore bark to lay its eggs. And I found it as we were kind of raking and moving some leaves out of the pathway. Look how small it is. That's my thumb. And so leaving perennials standing is another way that we can really support insects. So go back to the goldenrod gallfly with that kind of bulge in the middle of the goldenrod stem. If we were to cut down all of our perennials in the middle of winter, now I'm not saying everyone needs to be attached to goldenrod gallflies, but are you attached to woodpeckers? Because again, they utilize those over the winter. So leaving perennials standing, not only super helpful for the insects that utilize the stems, but also they create little microclimates underneath of those stems, and it looks beautiful, especially with a layer of snow on top, right? Adds more dimension to the winter garden. So the last group of insects, my goodness, that'd be a huge insect. The last group of wildlife that I wanted to talk about are our herps, or our reptiles and amphibians. And first up is the eastern box turtle. And the eastern box turtle is really unique among our native species of reptiles because they're actually freeze tolerant. Most of our reptiles are not freeze tolerant. So that essentially means that if their innards freeze, those crystals will cause parts of their body, because we know when water freezes, it expands. So we have to be really careful when your body is made mostly of water, because those cells will expand and explode. But eastern box turtles have found a way to avoid that. So they actually pull the water out of their auxiliary cells into their vital organs, and they can tolerate freezing, which is incredible. And they go into something called brumation, which is kind of like hibernation, but for reptiles. And so they'll find a nice little burrow, and they'll spend the winter under there brumating. But if they happen to freeze, they can tolerate it. In a similar vein, we'll see garter snakes utilizing abandoned animal burrows. Sometimes they'll use rock piles, things like that. And garter snakes actually spend the winter together. And they spend the winter in something called a hibernaculum, which is a really fun word. So it's called a hibernaculum because they kind of hibernate, but not really, because they're ectotherms, which means they rely on the outer temperature. But they will all be together to kind of keep that a little bit of radiant heat, which can be a little scary come April and March, because you'll see like 10 garter snakes popping out of a hole. But don't worry, garter snakes are great. They're awesome for pest control. They're super docile. And especially when you see them all coming out of the same hole at once, they're so cold. They're so slow. They're very, very slow. So no need to get freaked out. This was actually at Stoneleigh. This was only 5. This was a fairly small hibernaculum, but they come out, they sun themselves. It takes them like a couple hours to warm up enough to really start moving. So give them some space, give them some time, and then they'll act as pest control in your space. Now, wood frogs and spring peepers, this is another example of a really early emerging species of wildlife. We start hearing these definitely in March, sometimes even in February on a really nice warm day. And that's because they turn into popsicles. This is a wood frog popsicle in the lower right-hand corner. So again, they go into this kind of stage of suspended animation. They're freeze tolerant, and they spend those winters in the ponds where they will ultimately come out and do a lot of calling. And that allows them to be active as soon as they unfreeze, because they don't have to come out of like a hibernation, despite the fact that they are frozen. It takes them not very much time to come out, unfreeze, and start calling. So that's why we'll hear them on a really nice warm day in late winter or early spring. These guys are mostly found in fishless ponds. So if you're ever wondering why you might not hear spring peepers or wood frogs at a pond, they spend their time in fishless ponds. And then we've got 2 very cool turtle species. We've got snapping turtle and painted turtle. And these are 2 examples of reptiles that are not freeze tolerant. They cannot handle freezing. And so what they'll actually do, snapping turtles will go deep, deep, deep into the water of the pond that they're staying. They'll often bury themselves in mud. Water is a great buffer. It takes a lot of energy for water to heat up or to cool down. So, you know, often water is not freezing all the way to the bottom. And so they'll spend the winter under there in that very buffered area. And then once that freeze happens and thaws, then they're able to come back up. But one thing that they need to consider, needs to be considered in general, is that when a pond freezes, it does limit oxygen exchange. So they can't really tolerate ponds that are frozen for a really long time, which is why we don't see snappers and painted turtles way up north. But we do see them around here because we don't have those long, deep freezes. And then painted turtles do a very similar thing where they find a nice buffer in the mud or lower, deeper in a pond, and that keeps them above freezing, so they don't have to tolerate that freezing. And so that was a lot of information. So I just want to encourage you all have fantastic spaces you can walk around here at Hershey's Garden. You might have the community garden, you might have your own personal gardens. So I encourage you to go out, go hiking, go birding, just walk around, take notice of the things that are out there, because you will find examples and just signs of insects and other wildlife out in the winter garden, especially after the snow. You'll see those little paws running all around. And so with that, thank you so much, and I'm happy to take questions. Question in the back.